That night, as Richard's hands traced the curve of my face in the moonlight streaming through his bedroom windows, I realized that everything I'd feared about our age difference had been wrong. What I'd thought would make me feel small had made me feel like a woman for the first time in my life. What he'd thought would make him a predator had revealed a depth of tenderness I never knew existed in men. "Are you sure, Sophia?" His voice was rough with desire held barely in check, his blue eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my heart race. The moonlight caught the silver threading through his dark hair, highlighting the sharp angles of his face, the concern etched in every line. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I looked up at this man who'd saved me from a life of misery, who'd shown me what it meant to be cherished, who'd spent weeks fighting his attraction to me out of respect for my youth. Richard Menendez, the billionaire who could have any woman he wanted, was trembling at the thought of touching me. His hands were steady in boardrooms where million-dollar decisions were made, but with me, they shook with the weight of wanting something he'd convinced himself he shouldn't have. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who commanded corporate empires, who could make grown executives stammer with a single glance, reduced to asking permission from a 20-year-old girl who'd been a barista just months before. But that's what made this moment perfect, what made everything we'd fought through worth it. "I've never been more sure of anything," I whispered, my hands finding the buttons of his shirt, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my fingertips. "I'm not the scared girl you rescued anymore. I'm a woman who knows exactly what she wants." What happened next changed everything between us. The careful distance he'd maintained, the protective barriers I'd built, all of it dissolved in a night of passion that proved age is just a number when two souls recognize each other. He worshipped my body like I was precious art, every touch reverent, every kiss a promise. I discovered that innocence and experience could create something beautiful together, that the fear we'd both carried about our connection was nothing compared to the perfection of finally surrendering to it. The way he touched me, like I might break, like I was made of spun glass and starlight, told me everything I needed to know about the man beneath the powerful exterior. This wasn't conquest or possession. This was reverence, worship. A 49-year-old man discovering that love could make him feel young again. But our story didn't begin in that bedroom. It began 3 months earlier, when a broken teenager caught the attention of a man who'd forgotten how to feel anything at all. It began with coffee shop encounters and stolen glances, with the slow burn of attraction neither of us wanted to acknowledge, with the gradual realization that sometimes love doesn't follow the rules society sets for it. It began with two people who were exactly wrong for each other, discovering they were absolutely perfect together. But first, let me tell you how a broken 19-year-old and a guarded billionaire who should never have worked together discovered they were perfect for each other. My name is Sofia Martinez, and until 6 months ago, I had a perfectly ordinary life. 19 years old, sophomore at Portland State studying art history, sharing a cramped apartment with my best friend Maya. My biggest worry was affording textbooks. My greatest joy was spending Saturday mornings in the campus art gallery, dreaming of someday curating exhibitions in New York or Paris. My parents, Maria and Carlos, had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but hope and determination. Dad worked construction, his hands always rough with calluses that told stories of buildings he'd helped create. Mom cleaned offices at night, coming home with tired eyes but always asking about my classes, my dreams, my future. Everything they did was so I could have the education they'd never gotten. "Mija," my mother would say, stroking my hair as I studied late into the night, "education is the one thing no one can take from you." She was wrong. The accident happened on a rainy Thursday in March. Drunk driver ran a red light while my parents were coming home from their weekly grocery shopping trip. They died instantly, the police said, which was supposed to be a comfort, but only made the hole in my chest feel larger. One moment, I was texting my mom about dinner plans. The next, I was identifying bodies in a sterile morgue that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The funeral was a blur of flowers and condolences from people who'd known my parents as the quiet, hard-working couple who never missed church, who sent money back to family in Guadalajara, who believed in the American dream with a faith that seemed unshakable. Watching their caskets lowered into the ground, I felt like I was burying my entire world. The insurance barely covered their debts, leaving me with funeral expenses I couldn't afford and a future that suddenly seemed impossible. Everything I'd taken for granted, my education, my little apartment with Maya, my belief that hard work would be enough, crumbled in the space between one phone call and the next. "Don't worry, Sobrina," Uncle Roberto had said at the funeral, his arm around his wife Carmen's shoulders, both of them wearing expressions of practiced sympathy that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Family takes care of family. You'll come live with us until you get back on your feet." I should have been grateful. Roberto was my father's older brother, and he and Carmen had a nice house in the suburbs with a guest room that had been sitting empty for years. But from the moment I moved into their basement bedroom, surrounded by storage boxes and the smell of mothballs, I felt the weight of their resentment. I wasn't their beloved niece returning home. I was an obligation they'd inherited, a mouth to feed they couldn't afford, a reminder of family duty they'd never wanted to honor. "College is expensive," Carmen would say pointedly over dinner, her eyes calculating as she watched me push food around my plate. "Maybe it's time to think about more practical options. People your age, in your situation, need to be realistic about their futures." "There's good money in service work," Roberto would add, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "I know people who could help you find something that pays well, really well, if you're willing to be flexible about the work." The way he said it, the look that passed between them, made my skin crawl with implications I didn't want to understand. But I was 19, grieving, and completely dependent on them. Where else could I go? What other options did I have? "They found me a job at a coffee shop near campus to help you get back on your feet," they said, but I suspected it was really to remind me daily of everything I'd lost. Every morning, I'd wake up in that basement room, surrounded by boxes of my parents' belongings I couldn't bear to unpack, and force myself to smile at customers who got to worry about normal things like midterms and weekend plans. I told myself it was temporary, just until I figured out how to pay for school, how to get my life back. I had no idea that my real life was about to begin with a man whose attention would change everything. The Riverside Cafe was my sanctuary and my prison rolled into one. Close enough to campus that I could pretend I still belonged there, busy enough that the hours passed quickly, quiet enough that I could study during slow periods. The familiar rhythm of steaming milk and grinding beans became the soundtrack to my grief, a constant background hum that somehow made the silence in my head more bearable. I'd been working there for 2 weeks when everything changed. It was a Tuesday morning, rain drumming against the windows like impatient fingers, when I noticed him for the first time. Corner table, expensive navy suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, reading the Wall Street Journal with the kind of focused intensity that suggested every word mattered. Silver threading through dark hair that was perfectly styled despite the weather, strong hands wrapped around a simple black coffee that he'd barely touched. He was beautiful in that dangerous way older men sometimes are. Confidence worn like cologne, power radiating from every gesture, the kind of presence that made conversations quiet when he walked past. There was something about the way he held himself, the careful control in every movement, that spoke of a man accustomed to having his word be final, his decisions unquestioned. When his eyes lifted from his paper and met mine across the cafe, my breath caught in my throat. Blue as winter sky, sharp with intelligence, and focused on me with an attention that made my cheeks flush with heat I couldn't explain. For a moment, the busy cafe faded away. The chattering students, the hiss of the espresso machine, the rain against the windows, until it was just him looking at me like he was memorizing every detail of my face. I looked away quickly, busying myself with wiping down tables that were already clean, my heart hammering against my ribs in a rhythm I didn't recognize. When I dared to glance back, he was still watching me, his expression unreadable but intense, like a puzzle he was trying to solve. Something fluttered low in my stomach, attraction, recognition, awareness of myself as a woman in a way I'd never experienced before. That's when Uncle Roberto burst through the cafe door like a thundercloud, his face already twisted with the familiar expression that meant I was about to be humiliated in public. "There you are," he snarled, loud enough that half the cafe turned to stare, conversations dying as all attention focused on the drama unfolding. "Do you think you can just ignore my calls, pretend like you don't have responsibilities?" My face burned with humiliation as Roberto approached my station, his voice carrying across the quiet morning atmosphere like a slap. I could feel every customer's eyes on us, could see the way people leaned forward slightly, drawn to the spectacle of someone else's misery. "We need to talk about your attitude, Sophia. You're living in our house, eating our food, wearing clothes we buy for you." "Uncle Roberto, please," I whispered, acutely aware of the customers watching, particularly the man with the blue eyes, whose attention felt like a weight on my skin. "Can we discuss this at home?" "No, we'll discuss it now." His hand shot out, gripping my wrist tight enough that I could feel my pulse beating against his fingers. "Carmen found you a better job, real money, not this minimum wage bullshit. You start tonight and you'll be grateful for the opportunity." The way he said it, the implications in his tone, made my stomach turn. I knew the kind of opportunities Roberto's friends offered young women, had heard enough whispered conversations to understand what he was really talking about. "I don't want another job. I like working here." "What you want doesn't matter." His grip tightened, and I winced as his fingers dug into the delicate bones of my wrist. "You'll do what's best for the family that's supporting you, or you can find somewhere else to live. See how far your precious pride gets you on the streets." That's when I felt it, the weight of someone's stare, heavy and focused. I looked up to find the man from the corner table watching our confrontation with laser-sharp attention, his jaw tight with something that looked like controlled fury. He wasn't just observing, he was cataloging every detail, every word, every sign of Roberto's aggression, his hands clenched around his coffee cup like he was restraining himself from intervening. When Roberto finally stormed out with threats about discussing this properly at home, the mysterious man continued to watch me as I shakily returned to work, my hands trembling, as I tried to clean tables, serve customers, pretend everything was normal. My wrist throbbed where Roberto had grabbed it, and I could already see the faint marks his fingers had left. He stayed for another hour, never looking at his poker again, his attention fixed on me with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow felt protective instead. When he finally left, placing a $20 bill on the table for a $4 coffee, I found a business card underneath. Richard Menendez, CEO, Menendez Enterprises. On the back, written in elegant handwriting that spoke of expensive education and careful breeding, "If you need help, call me." Richard Menendez came back the next morning. Same corner table, same expensive suit, but this time he actually ordered coffee, black, no sugar. His voice was deep, cultured, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having to ask for anything twice, never having to repeat himself to be heard and obeyed. "Thank you," he said when I brought his cup, and our fingers brushed for just a moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through me, warm, electric, completely inappropriate given that he was clearly old enough to be my father. His skin was warm and surprisingly soft for a man who commanded corporate empires, and the brief touch lingered on my fingertips long after I'd stepped away. "You're welcome," I managed, hoping he couldn't hear the slight tremor in my voice, the way my breath had caught at such a simple, innocent contact. "Sophia, right?" At my surprised look, he gestured to my name tag with a small smile that transformed his austere features, making him look younger, more approachable. "I'm Richard." Just Richard. No last name, no explanation for why he'd been here yesterday during my humiliation with Roberto, but there was something in his eyes, concern, interest, a combination of both, that made my pulse quicken and my cheeks warm with awareness. He came back every morning that week, establishing a routine that I found myself looking forward to with an anticipation that felt dangerous. Small conversations at first, carefully neutral topics that revealed nothing of his obvious wealth or power. He asked about my classes with genuine interest, seemed genuinely engaged when I mentioned my art history background, never making me feel like my interrupted education was a failure or my current situation a mark of shame. Renaissance art, he mused on Wednesday when he noticed my textbook open beside the register. Fascinating period. All that patronage, wealthy men supporting beautiful art. His blue eyes found mine, though I suppose the artists weren't always appreciated in their own time. No, I agreed, wondering why the conversation felt loaded with subtext I couldn't quite decode. Often they were seen as too young, too inexperienced, too different from what people expected. And yet some patrons recognized their value despite the age difference, despite social conventions. His voice was casual, but his gaze was intent. Sometimes the most beautiful art comes from unexpected combinations. I felt heat creep up my neck, understanding on some instinctive level that we weren't really talking about Renaissance painters anymore. By Friday, I was watching the clock, counting minutes until his usual arrival time. When he walked through the door at exactly 8:15, my heart did this little skip that made me feel foolish and alive at the same time. "You seem sad," he observed that morning, his blue eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me feel exposed, like he could see through all my careful attempts to appear fine. "Just tired," I lied, but we both knew it was more than that. The exhaustion went bone deep, the result of grief and stress and the constant walking on eggshells atmosphere at Roberto's house. Bad family situation? His question was casual, but I caught something darker underneath, like he already knew the answer, like he'd been thinking about my circumstances more than a casual customer should. I hesitated, wondering why I felt compelled to tell this stranger the truth, why his attention felt like sunlight after months of living in shadows. Something like that. Richard nodded slowly, his jaw tightening slightly in a way that suggested controlled anger. Family should protect you, not diminish you. They should build you up, not tear you down for their own purposes. The statement hung between us, loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp, but that resonated somewhere deep in my chest. Who was this man? Why did he seem to care about a 19-year-old coffee shop worker's problems? And why did every interaction with him make me feel more alive than I had since my parents died? "I should get back to work," I said, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of his attention, by the way he made me want things I couldn't name. "Of course." He stood, and I was struck again by his height, by the way his presence seemed to command the space around him. "Same time tomorrow?" It sounded like a question, but his confident smile suggested he already knew the answer. There was something almost predatory in his certainty, but it didn't feel threatening. Instead, it felt like being seen, being valued, being worth someone's consistent attention. As I watched him leave, my eyes traced the broad line of his shoulders, the confident set of his posture, the way other customers unconsciously moved out of his path. Richard Menendez was dangerous in all the ways that mattered, powerful, attractive, clearly interested in me despite all the reasons he shouldn't be. And despite every rational thought in my head, I was already counting the hours until I'd see him again. The morning conversations became the brightest part of my increasingly difficult days. Richard had a way of making me feel intelligent, interesting, worthy of attention. Everything Roberto and Carmen made sure I knew I wasn't. He'd ask about my thoughts on different artists, my opinions on museum exhibitions I'd only read about online, my dreams for the future, as if I actually had a right to have them, as if my 19-year-old opinions mattered to a man who commanded boardrooms full of executives. "You light up when you talk about art," he observed one morning, his blue eyes soft with something that made my pulse quicken and my stomach flutter with awareness. It's beautiful to watch passion ignite in someone so young. The way he said beautiful, the way his gaze lingered on my face like he was memorizing every detail, sent warmth spiraling through me in places I'd never been conscious of before. "You're easy to talk to." "Am I?" His smile was amused, knowing, carrying hints of experiences I couldn't fathom. "Most people find me intimidating. Boardroom executives twice your age have been known to stutter in my presence." I could see why. Even sitting casually in a coffee shop, Richard radiated the kind of power and confidence that made waitresses drop their voices to reverent whispers, and businessmen automatically defer to his presence. The expensive watch on his wrist probably cost more than most people made in a year, and there was something in his posture that spoke of a man accustomed to having his smallest requests treated as commands. But with me, he was different. Patient, gentle, genuinely interested in what I had to say, as if my thoughts were precious things worth careful handling. "You don't intimidate me," I said, then immediately worried I sounded naive, like the teenager I was trying so hard not to be. "No." He leaned forward slightly, and suddenly he was close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made my stomach flutter and my breath catch. "Maybe you should be intimidated, Sophia." The way he said my name, low and intimate like a caress, made my breath catch in my throat. There was something in his voice, in the way his eyes darkened as they held mine, that spoke of things I'd never experienced but desperately wanted to understand. Dangerous things, adult things. Why? The word came out softer than I intended, breathless with an awareness I was too young to fully comprehend. "Because I'm 30 years older than you. Because I could buy this entire building without noticing the expense. Because when I look at you—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening with visible restraint, hands clenching slightly on the table. "Because I should know better than to want the things I want." The admission hung between us, loaded with implications that made my heart race and heat pool low in my stomach. He was attracted to me. This powerful, gorgeous man was fighting his own desires, and somehow that made him even more irresistible, more magnetic than any boy my age had ever been. "What if I don't want you to know better?" The words escaped before I could stop them, bold and breathless and completely unlike anything I'd ever said to anyone. Richard's eyes flashed with something dark and hungry before he controlled his expression, but not before I saw the want there, the desire he was so carefully restraining. "Don't say things like that, Sophia." "Why not?" I challenged, leaning forward unconsciously, drawn by something stronger than logic or propriety. "Because you're 19 years old, and you deserve someone who won't question whether he's taking advantage of you." His voice was rough, strained with the effort of maintaining control. "You deserve someone your own age, with your own dreams, your own timeline, someone who won't make you doubt your own motivations." "And what if I don't want someone my own age?" I challenged, surprising myself with my boldness, with the certainty in my voice. "What if I want someone who actually sees me, who treats me like I'm worth something?" "I see you," he said quietly, his gaze intense enough to make me shiver. "God help me, I see everything about you. That's the problem." The way he looked at me, like I was something he wanted desperately but couldn't allow himself to have, like I was a temptation he was fighting with every fiber of his considerable willpower, made something deep inside me clench with want I'd never experienced before. "Richard." I should go. He stood abruptly, but not before I caught the way his eyes dropped to my lips, the visible tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements. I'll see you tomorrow." As I watched him leave, my body humming with unfamiliar awareness and my heart pounding with emotions I couldn't name, I realized I was in trouble. Because whatever this was between us, it was growing stronger every day, and my 19-year-old heart didn't care about age gaps or power dynamics or social conventions. It only cared about the way Richard Menendez made me feel like I was worth something precious. Everything changed the night Roberto decided to escalate his campaign to control my life. I was closing the cafe alone when he appeared, Carmen in tow, both of them wearing expressions that made my blood run cold with their calculated determination. "Time for a family meeting," Roberto announced, his voice carrying the false cheer that always preceded his worst demands, the kind of tone that meant I was about to lose another piece of whatever freedom I had left. "I'm working," I said, continuing to wipe down tables with hands that had started to shake, my movements becoming mechanical as anxiety flooded my system. "Not anymore." Carmen's smile was sharp as a blade, her eyes glittering with something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "We've found you a much better opportunity. More money, flexible hours, the kind of work that appreciates a girl with your natural assets." The way she said it made my skin crawl, made me understand with sickening clarity what kind of opportunity they had in mind. I'd heard whispers about the places Roberto's friends owned, establishments where young women traded their dignity for survival money. "I'm not quitting this job." My voice was stronger than I felt, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "Yes, you are." Roberto's facade dropped, revealing the cold calculation underneath, the man who saw me as nothing more than a commodity to be leveraged. "Tonight, there's a gentleman's club downtown that needs cocktail waitresses. The tips alone will be 10 times what you make here, and the work," his smile made my stomach turn, "well, let's say it's very lucrative for girls who know how to please their customers." "Absolutely not." The words came out fierce, desperate. "You don't have a choice." His voice turned menacing, and I saw Carmen nod approvingly from behind him, both of them clearly having planned this moment for weeks. "You live in our house, eat our food, wear clothes we buy you. You'll do what we tell you to do, or you can find somewhere else to live." The ultimatum hung in the air like a poison cloud. Where would I go? How would I survive? I was trapped, and they knew it, had been systematically tightening the noose of my dependence until this moment when they could finally cash in on their investment. "The manager is expecting you at 9, Carmen added, checking her watch with obvious satisfaction. "Wear something tight, shows off that young body of yours. First impressions matter in that business." That's when the cafe door chimed, and Richard stepped inside like an answer to a prayer I hadn't known I was making. He moved with purposeful strides, his expensive overcoat still dotted with raindrops, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "I'm sorry, we're closed," I started to say, but he was already moving toward us with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he'd been watching, waiting, planning this intervention. "Mr. Menendez," Roberto's voice immediately shifted to obsequious respect, his entire demeanor changing in the presence of real power. "We were just finishing up family business." "Were you?" Richard's attention fixed on my uncle with laser precision, and I could see the exact moment he cataloged Roberto's aggressive posture, Carmen's predatory smile, my obvious distress. "Because from the parking lot, it sounded like you were threatening a teenage girl." "She's our responsibility," Carmen interjected, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence under Richard's cold stare. "We're discussing her future career prospects." "Her future?" Richard's voice was deadly quiet, and something in his tone made Roberto take an unconscious step backward. "And does that future include forcing her into sex work?" The blunt assessment made Roberto sputter indignantly. "It's cocktail service, perfectly legitimate." "At a strip club." Richard's smile was cold as winter, and I realized he knew exactly what kind of establishment they were talking about. "Yes, I know the type of place you're referring to. I also know what kind of opportunities they offer young, desperate girls with nowhere else to turn." The color drained from Roberto's face. "You can't interfere in family matters." "Actually, I can." Richard's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of people, from boardrooms where his word was law. "Sophia, get your things, you're coming with me." She can't just, Carmen began, but Richard's attention shifted to her with such intensity that she actually stepped backward. She's 19, legally an adult. She can go wherever she wants. His gaze moved to me, his voice gentling, but still carrying that underlying steel. Unless you want to stay, Sophia, unless this is the life you've chosen for yourself. The choice he offered was an illusion. There was no real choice between Richard's protection and Roberto's exploitation. But the way he asked, like my decision mattered, like I had agency in my own life, made my heart swell with something I hadn't felt in months: hope. "I'll get my bag," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but filled with more determination than I'd felt since my parents died. As I gathered my few belongings from behind the counter, I could hear Richard speaking quietly to my uncle and aunt, his voice too low for me to make out the words, but clearly delivering some kind of warning that left them both pale and shaken. "Ready?" Richard asked when I returned, and there was something protective in the way he positioned himself between me and my relatives, like a shield I hadn't known I needed. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Then let's go home." Home. The word sent warmth spiraling through me as I followed him into the night, leaving my prison behind and walking toward a future I couldn't yet imagine, but already knew would be better than anything I was leaving. Richard's home was a revelation, all clean lines and warm wood, floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city lights like living art, spaces designed for both comfort and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. The guest room he showed me was larger than the apartment I'd shared with Maya, with its own bathroom done in marble and soft grays, and a reading nook by the window that overlooked gardens I could barely make out in the darkness. "Is this really okay?" I asked, standing in the doorway like I might contaminate something precious if I actually entered the space that was apparently mine. "Sophia, look at me." He turned from where he'd been adjusting the blinds, his blue eyes serious and intent. "You're safe here. For as long as you need, this is your home. No conditions, no expectations, no debts to repay." The word home did things to my chest I didn't want to examine too closely, made me realize how long it had been since anywhere had felt like a place where I belonged. "I can't afford—" "I'm not asking you to pay rent. I'm asking you to let someone take care of you for once." His voice was gentle but firm, brooking no argument. "When's the last time anyone did that? When's the last time someone put your needs first?" I couldn't remember. Even my parents, as loving as they'd been, had needed me to be strong, responsible, focused on my future, because they couldn't afford for me to be anything else. But Richard was offering something I'd never had: the luxury of being young, of being cared for without expectations, of existing without constantly proving my worth. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, the question that had been burning in my chest since he'd walked into that cafe. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his expression complex, like he was weighing how much truth he could safely share. "Because you deserve better than what they were giving you. Because you—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Because I can, and that should be enough." The weeks that followed were the happiest I'd been since my parents died. Richard arranged for me to audit art history courses at the university, covering the fees without making it feel like charity, treating my education like an investment worth making. We fell into a comfortable routine that felt natural despite its newness. Breakfast together before his workday started, quiet dinners where he'd ask about my classes with genuine interest, evenings in his library where we'd read in companionable silence, the air thick with unspoken awareness. But beneath the domestic tranquility, something else was growing. The way Richard's eyes would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking, the careful distance he maintained, even when every instinct seemed to be pulling him closer, the tension that crackled between us whenever we were in the same room, like electricity seeking ground. I found myself studying him when he wasn't aware, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking, the unconscious elegance of his movements, the silver at his temples that caught the light. He was handsome in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with confidence, experience, the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. "You don't have to stay on your side of the couch," I told him one evening as we watched a documentary about Renaissance art, his body language so carefully controlled that it was almost comical. "Yes, I do," he replied, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining that distance. "Richard, Sophia, you're 19 years old and you've been through trauma. The last thing you need is some middle-aged man taking advantage of your gratitude, your vulnerability, your dependence on him." The words came out rough, like he'd been rehearsing them. What if it's not gratitude? The question hung between us, dangerous and honest and impossible to take back. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands clenching on the couch cushions like he was physically restraining himself. Don't what? Don't feel things? Don't notice how you look at me sometimes like you're starving?" I shifted closer, drawn by something stronger than common sense or self-preservation. "Don't want you?" Christ, Sophia. His voice was rough, desperate, and I could see the war being fought behind his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." I was close enough now to see the pulse racing in his throat, to smell his cologne, to feel the heat radiating from his body like he was burning up from the inside. "The question is what you're going to do about it." For a moment, I thought he might close the distance between us. His eyes dropped to my lips, his breathing grew shallow, and I could feel the want radiating from him like heat from a fire, almost tangible in its intensity. Then he stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair and destroying its perfect styling. "I'm going to pretend this conversation never happened, and you're going to let me." But as I watched him leave the room, I saw the way his hands shook, the visible tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements that spoke of a man hanging on to his restraint by the thinnest of threads. Richard Menendez was fighting a losing battle against his own desires, and I was beginning to realize I didn't want him to win. Living with Richard was like existing in a state of constant, delicious tension that was slowly driving me insane with want. Every innocent touch, his hand brushing mine as he passed the coffee, his fingers steadying me when I stumbled on the stairs, the way he'd unconsciously touch my back when guiding me through doorways sent electricity shooting through my system like I'd been struck by lightning. I'd catch him watching me with an intensity that made my breath hitch and my skin flush with heat, only to see him look away with visible self-control, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining distance. The problem was, my 19-year-old body didn't understand restraint. Every night I'd lie in my bed, hyper-aware that he was just down the hall, separated by nothing more than thin walls and his iron will, wondering what would happen if I simply walked to his room and told him I wanted him. The attraction was eating me alive from the inside out, and worse, I could see it was affecting him too, in the careful way he moved around me, the deliberate space he maintained between us. I started paying attention to the little things, the way his eyes would darken when I stretched to reach something high, how his breathing would change when I'd curl up on the couch in my pajamas, the tension in his shoulders when I'd laugh at something he said. He was fighting himself as much as he was fighting me, and that knowledge was intoxicating. "You're distracted," he observed one morning over breakfast, his blue eyes studying my face with the kind of attention that made me feel exposed, like he could see straight through to my most secret thoughts. "Just tired," I lied, not mentioning that I'd barely slept thinking about the way his shirt had clung to his chest when he'd reached for something the night before, the glimpse of tanned skin at his throat when he'd loosened his tie. "Perhaps you should see other people your age, make friends." The suggestion sounded forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me, his voice carefully neutral. "There's a whole world of experiences you should be having. College parties, dating, all the normal things 19-year-olds do." What if I don't want experiences with people my age? The words tumbled out before I could stop them, raw with honesty I hadn't meant to reveal. Richard's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and I saw something flash in his eyes. Surprise, desire, fear. Sophia, I'm not a child, Richard. I'm a woman who knows what she wants. I stood, moving around the table until I was close enough to see the way his pupils dilated, the careful control in his breathing. I'm a woman who thinks about you when she should be sleeping. The admission hung between us like a lit fuse, dangerous and inevitable. Richard's hands clenched on the table, his knuckles white with the effort of restraint. Don't say things like that. His voice was strained, but I caught the way his eyes darkened with want he couldn't quite hide. Why? Because it makes you uncomfortable? Or because it makes you want things you think you shouldn't want? I leaned closer, drawn by the magnetic pull that seemed to exist between us. Because it makes you imagine things you've been trying not to imagine? Because it makes me want to do things that would be wrong. His admission came out rough, honest, and it sent heat spiraling through me like molten gold. Things that would change everything between us. What if they wouldn't be wrong? What if they'd be exactly right? My voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed to echo in the sudden silence between us. For a moment, Richard's control cracked. His eyes dropped to my lips, his breathing grew shallow, and I could see the war between desire and conscience playing out across his features like a battle he was slowly losing. Then his phone rang, shattering the moment like glass hitting concrete. "Menendez," he answered, his voice professionally controlled, but I could see his hands were shaking as he lifted the device to his ear. As he took the call, stepping away from me and the dangerous electricity that crackled between us, I realized we were approaching a breaking point. The careful distance he maintained was becoming impossible to sustain, like trying to hold back an ocean with willpower alone. Every conversation, every shared glance, every accidental touch was building towards something that felt as inevitable as gravity. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything between us. I went shopping for a dress, not the conservative clothes Richard had bought me, but something that would make my intentions impossible to ignore, something that would force him to stop treating me like a child and start seeing me as the woman I'd become under his careful protection. If Richard was going to keep insisting I was too young, too innocent, too grateful to know my own mind, then I was going to have to prove him wrong, even if it meant crossing lines we could never uncross, even if it meant risking the safety and security he'd given me. The question was, when I finally made my move, would his desire be stronger than his conscience? And was I prepared for the consequences either way? I found the photographs by accident while looking for a book in Richard's study. A manila envelope had slipped behind his desk, and when I retrieved it, several images scattered across the floor like secrets spilling into the light. Pictures of me at the coffee shop, walking across campus, sitting alone in the university library. Professional quality, taken with a telephoto lens from a distance. Some were dated weeks before we'd officially met. My hands shook as I gathered them up, my mind reeling with implications I didn't want to consider. Richard had been watching me, following me, documenting my life before that morning Roberto had confronted me in the cafe. Our meeting hadn't been chance. It had been planned, orchestrated, manipulated. The worst part wasn't the invasion of privacy. It was the doubt that immediately flooded my system. Everything I'd felt, everything I'd believed about our connection, was any of it real, or was I just another project for a wealthy man with a savior complex? Sophia? His voice from the doorway made me jump, the photographs scattering again across the hardwood floor like evidence of a crime I'd stumbled into. Richard stood frozen when he saw what I'd found, his face going pale beneath his tan. For a moment, neither of us moved, the silence stretching between us like a chasm that might be impossible to cross. "I can explain," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Explain what? That you've been stalking me?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, hurt and confusion making me defensive. "That you researched me like some kind of investment opportunity?" It's not what it looks like. It looks like you've been watching me for weeks, like you planned our meeting, orchestrated everything. I stood, backing away from him, needing distance to think clearly. Was any of it real, Richard? Or am I just some project you decided to take on? The pain that flashed across his face looked genuine, but I was too shaken to trust my own judgment anymore. Let me explain. Explain what? How you picked out some pathetic teenager to rescue? How good it made you feel to save poor little Sophia? My voice broke on the words, and I hated how young I sounded, how vulnerable. That's not how it was. Then how was it? I demanded, tears stinging my eyes. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you decided I needed saving and made it happen. Everything, the job offer, living here, making me feel special, it was all part of some plan. Richard stepped into the room, his movements careful, like he was approaching a wounded animal. Sophia, please, let me tell you the truth. The truth? I laughed bitterly. You mean there's more? He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was wrestling with how much to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but weighted with something I couldn't identify. I have an ex-wife, Elena. She was a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases, women's rights. His eyes met mine, unflinching. She used to come home with stories about girls in situations like yours, trapped, dependent, being pushed toward things they didn't want to do. I felt something cold settle in my chest, but I forced myself to listen. When I saw what your uncle was doing to you, when I heard how he spoke to you, Richard's voice tightened with controlled anger. I remembered Elena's stories. I couldn't stand by and watch someone hurt you. So you decided to play hero? The words tasted bitter in my mouth. I decided I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. His voice was quiet but intense. Yes, I had you followed. Yes, I learned about your situation. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I acted. And the coffee shop, our conversations, those were real. He moved closer, and I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the pain at having to confess this. Sophia, everything between us has been real. The attraction, the connection, I never planned for that. How do I know what's real and what's manipulation? My voice was small, uncertain, the question that was eating me alive. Because if I'd planned to seduce you, I wouldn't have spent every night fighting the urge to touch you. I wouldn't have tried to convince you to date people your own age. I wouldn't have what? Richard's control cracked slightly, vulnerability bleeding through his careful composure. Wouldn't have fallen in love with you while trying to keep you safe from men like me. The admission hit me like a physical blow, making my breath catch and my heart race with equal parts hope and fear. You love me? God help me, yes. His voice was rough with emotion he'd been holding back for weeks. But Sophia, that doesn't change the fact that I manipulated the situation, that I made choices about your life without your knowledge or consent. To protect me, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place in my mind. To ease my own conscience, he corrected, his honesty brutal and necessary. Don't make me more noble than I am. I studied his face, seeing the genuine torment there, the self-recrimination that had been eating him alive. You really love me? More than I should, more than is wise. His blue eyes were intense, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. But loving you doesn't make what I did right. For the first time since finding the photographs, I felt my anger begin to fade, replaced by something more complex. Richard hadn't been playing games. He'd been trying to save me while fighting his own desires. The manipulation hurt, but the love underneath it was real. What happens now? I whispered. Now, you decide if you can forgive me, and if what you feel is real enough to survive the truth. I spent 3 days avoiding Richard, taking my meals in my room, slipping out when I heard him in the kitchen, existing in the same house like a ghost haunting spaces he'd vacated. The photographs sat on my dresser like evidence in a trial I couldn't bring myself to start, their glossy surfaces reflecting my own confused face every time I caught sight of them. Every time I looked at them, I felt that same twisted mixture of hurt and understanding, betrayal, and something that might have been gratitude. But on the fourth morning, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. The hurt was still there, but underneath it was something else, curiosity. Not about whether Richard loved me, but about why he'd been so careful, so controlled, so terrified of crossing lines with me. I found him in the garden, sitting on the stone bench where we'd shared so many evening conversations, looking older somehow, worn down by guilt and sleepless nights. "I've been thinking," I said, settling beside him with careful distance between us. "And?" I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. "You said your ex-wife was a lawyer, that she told you stories about girls like me." Richard nodded, his expression guarded. "What happened to your marriage?" The question surprised even me, but I needed to understand. Richard was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Elena left me because I was exactly the kind of man she spent her career fighting against." His hands clenched in his lap. Not abusive, not obviously predatory, but controlling, disconnected. I used my wealth and power to get what I wanted without considering the impact on others. "What did you do?" It wasn't what I did, it was what I didn't do. His voice was heavy with self-recrimination. She'd come home from work, exhausted from fighting for women who had no power, no resources, no way to escape situations that were destroying them. And I'd be completely indifferent. I'd change the subject, make it about business, treat her passion like it was an inconvenience. I could see the pain in his profile, the weight of regret he'd been carrying. She tried to make me understand, brought me to fundraisers, introduced me to clients who'd escaped abusive situations, asked me to donate money or time to her causes. Richard's jaw tightened. I wrote checks, big ones, thought that was enough. But it wasn't. She said I was exactly the problem she was fighting, men who thought money could solve everything, who couldn't see past their own privilege to understand real suffering. His voice cracked slightly. She said I had all the power in the world to help people, and I chose to use it only for myself. I was beginning to understand why finding me in that cafe had affected him so deeply. The night she left, she told me something I'll never forget. Richard turned to look at me, his eyes raw with pain. She said that someday I'd see someone suffering right in front of me, and I'd have to choose between doing nothing, like I always had, or proving I was capable of being the man she'd hoped I could become. "And then you saw me," I said softly. "And then I saw you." His voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear it. 19 years old, being humiliated by your uncle, trapped in a situation that was going to destroy you. And I heard Elena's voice in my head asking me what kind of man I was going to choose to be. The pieces were falling into place now. The real reason for Richard's careful control, his fear of touching me, his insistence that I was too young and deserved better. You weren't trying to seduce me, I realized. You were trying not to become another man who took advantage of a vulnerable girl. I was trying to save you without becoming the kind of predator Elena spent her career fighting. His voice was thick with emotion. But Sophia, the moment I saw you, the moment we started talking, I wanted you, and that terrified me. Because you thought it made you like them, like the men who hurt the women Elena represented? Because I thought it made me exactly what Elena always said I was, a powerful man who takes what he wants without considering the cost to others. I understood now why he'd been so careful, so controlled, so terrified of crossing lines. He wasn't fighting his attraction to me because he didn't care. He was fighting it because he cared too much to risk becoming the kind of man who would hurt me. "Richard," I said gently, "look at me." He turned, his blue eyes vulnerable in a way that made my heart ache. "Elena was wrong about you," I said with certainty that surprised me. "The men she represented, the ones who hurt women, they don't spend months agonizing over whether they're taking advantage. They don't sacrifice their own desires to protect someone else's well-being. They don't investigate a girl's situation to save her instead of seduce her. But I manipulated." "You intervened," I corrected. "There's a difference. Manipulation is about control, about getting what you want regardless of the cost to others. What you did was sacrifice what you wanted to give me what I needed." Richard stared at me, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "The photographs, the investigation. Yes, that was wrong. You should have told me from the beginning." I reached for his hands, finding them cold despite the warm morning. "But Richard, everything else? The way you've treated me, the respect you've shown, the careful distance you've maintained even when I could see how much you wanted to close it? Sophia, that's not predatory behavior. That's not taking advantage. That's a man who loves someone enough to put her well-being before his own desires." My voice was steady, certain. "That's the man Elena hoped you could become." For the first time since I'd found those photographs, Richard's careful control cracked completely. His shoulders shook as he pulled me against him, his face buried in my hair. "I love you," he whispered. "God, Sophia, I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too," I whispered back, and felt the last of my doubt dissolve. "But we're going to do this right. No more secrets, no more guilt, no more treating me like I'm too fragile to handle the truth." "What are you saying?" I pulled back to look at him, seeing the man who'd saved me, not because he wanted to possess me, but because he couldn't bear to watch me suffer. "I'm saying it's time to stop being afraid of what we feel. It's time to trust that love, real love, doesn't diminish people, it makes them stronger." I spent 3 days avoiding Richard, taking my meals in my room, slipping out when I heard him in the kitchen, existing in the same house like a ghost haunting spaces he'd vacated. The photographs sat on my dresser like evidence in a trial I couldn't bring myself to start, their glossy surfaces reflecting my own confused face every time I caught sight of them. "I need space," I told Richard when I finally emerged on the 4th morning, finding him in the garden, sitting on the stone bench where we'd shared so many evening conversations that now felt tainted by deception. He looked older somehow, worn down by guilt and sleepless nights, the confident composure I'd come to associate with him replaced by something more fragile. "I've been thinking," I said, settling beside him with careful distance between us. "And?" "About what you said, about being like those men your ex-wife used to represent." The words felt heavy on my tongue. "About whether what we have is real or just another kind of manipulation." Richard winced like I'd struck him. "Sophia, the thing is, I can't know for sure, can I? I can't separate my feelings from my circumstances, my gratitude from my attraction, my dependence from my desire." I stared out at the manicured gardens, seeing them differently now. Everything I think I feel could just be Stockholm Syndrome with better thread count. "That's not, isn't it?" I turned to face him, seeing the pain in his expression. How does a 19-year-old girl distinguish between salvation and seduction when they're wrapped in the same expensive package? How do I know if I love you or if I just love not being afraid anymore? The questions hung between us, ugly and necessary. Because he was right, there was no way to know. No way to untangle the complex web of power, protection, attraction, and gratitude that had woven itself around us. "So what happens now?" Richard's voice was quiet, defeated. "Now I figure out who I am when I'm not running from something or being saved by someone." I stood, my decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I'm going to take that apartment you offered, live on my own for a while, see what my feelings look like when they're not tangled up in dependence." "And us?" I looked down at him, this man who'd become everything to me, who'd saved me and confused me and made me question every emotion I thought I understood. There is no us right now. There's just a 19-year-old girl who needs to learn who she is, and a 49-year-old man who needs to figure out the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. Richard nodded slowly, and I could see him forcing himself to accept what I was saying, even though it was clearly tearing him apart. The apartment will be ready whenever you want it. Thank you. I started to leave, then turned back. Richard, for what it's worth, I don't think you're a predator. I think you're a man who got in over his head and didn't know how to handle it. But that doesn't make this less complicated. No, he agreed quietly. It doesn't. That afternoon, I packed my few belongings and moved into the downtown apartment Richard had arranged. It was beautiful, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city I was finally free to explore. But as I stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes and silence, I felt more alone than I had since my parents died. My phone buzzed constantly for the first week. Roberto, suddenly desperate to reconnect now that word had gotten out about my connection to Richard Menendez. Carmen, wanting to apologize and make things right. Even people from school who'd barely spoken to me before, suddenly interested in my story. But the call I was waiting for never came. Richard kept his distance, respecting the space I'd asked for, even though I could feel the absence of him like a phantom limb. I got a job at an art gallery, enrolled in night classes, tried to build a life that belonged to me alone. But every evening, as I sat in my beautiful apartment eating takeout and watching the city lights, I found myself wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. 3 months of independence taught me things about myself I'd never had the space to discover. I was stronger than I'd thought, capable of surviving on my own, able to make decisions without someone else's approval or protection. I discovered I liked abstract expressionism more than Renaissance art, preferred jazz clubs to fancy restaurants, could hold my own in conversations with people who didn't know my story. But I also discovered that strength and capability weren't the same thing as happiness. The realization hit me on a rainy Thursday evening as I stood in the gallery where I worked, watching a middle-aged couple examine a painting. The way they moved around each other, the unconscious synchronization of their steps, the comfortable silence between them, it reminded me achingly of those quiet evenings with Richard. "That's a beautiful piece," the woman said to me, noticing my attention. "It is," I agreed. "The artist painted it for his wife. 30-year age difference, apparently. Everyone said it wouldn't work." "Did it?" I looked at the painting, all warm colors and intertwined figures, passion and tenderness rendered in oil and hope. They were married for 40 years. That night, I finally admitted what I'd been trying to deny for months. I missed Richard. Not just his protection or his wealth or the safety he represented, but him. The way he listened when I talked about art, the careful attention he paid to my opinions, the way he made me feel intelligent and valued and desired. More importantly, I'd figured out the difference between dependence and choice. When I'd lived with my uncle and aunt, I'd had no options, no agency, no power to change my circumstances. Every day had been about survival, about making myself small enough to avoid their anger, useful enough to avoid being thrown out. With Richard, I'd had choices I'd been too scared to recognize. I could have asked for my own apartment from the beginning, could have insisted on paying my own way, setting my own boundaries, defining our relationship on my terms. Instead, I'd let fear and inexperience keep me passive, accepting rather than participating. But now I knew better. Now I knew the difference between being saved and being cared for, between protection and control, between gratitude and love. The question was, would Richard be able to see the difference too? I called him on a Friday night, my hands shaking as I dialed the number I'd memorized but never used. "Sophia?" His voice was careful, cautious, but I could hear the hope underneath. "Hi," I said, suddenly nervous. "I was wondering, would you like to have coffee sometime? As equals this time. My treat." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then, "I'd like that very much." "Good," I smiled, feeling something loosen in my chest. "There's a place I know. Neutral territory. We can talk about art and see where things go from there. No pressure, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. No pressure, I agreed. Just two adults who care about each other, figuring out if they can make something work. When I hung up, I realized I was crying, but for the first time in months, they were tears of hope rather than loss. The coffee shop I chose was deliberately different from the Riverside Cafe, brighter, busier, the kind of place where our conversation would be just another murmur in the ambient noise of a dozen other first dates and reconciliations. When Richard arrived, he looked exactly as I remembered, but somehow different, less imposing, more human, like the careful armor of control he usually wore had been set aside for the afternoon. "You look good," he said, settling into the chair across from me with the kind of careful politeness reserved for near strangers. "Independent life suits you." "Thank you." I studied his face, noting the new lines around his eyes, the slight hollowness in his cheeks that suggested he'd been sleeping as poorly as I had. "You look tired." "I am tired." His honesty surprised me. Turns out guilt is exhausting. "Is that what this is? Guilt?" Richard was quiet for a moment, considering his coffee like it held answers. "Among other things, regret, self-recrimination, missing you so much it feels like losing a limb." The admission hung between us, more intimate than anything we'd shared when I lived in his house. "I missed you too," I said quietly, but I needed to figure out if I missed you or just missed feeling safe. "And I missed you." I leaned forward, my hands wrapped around my mug for warmth. "The way you listened when I talked about art. The way you made me feel like my opinions mattered. The way you looked at me like I was something precious." "You are something precious." His voice was soft, certain. "I know that now. But when I was living with you, I wasn't sure if you saw me as precious or pitiful, if your feelings came from desire or duty." I met his eyes directly. I needed to know the difference. "And now you do?" Richard asked, his voice carefully controlled, but I could see the hope flickering in his blue eyes. "Now I know that I'm capable of taking care of myself, that I don't need you to survive." I paused, gathering courage for what I was about to say. But I also know that not needing someone and not wanting them are two very different things. Richard's expression shifted, vulnerability replacing the careful distance he'd maintained. "Sophia, I want to try again," I said before he could speak, my heart hammering against my ribs. "But differently this time, as equals, not as savior and victim, with boundaries and honest communication and the understanding that I'm choosing you, not just accepting rescue." "You're sure?" His voice was rough with barely contained emotion. "Because once we do this, once we acknowledge what's between us, I'm sure." I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine, feeling the familiar jolt of electricity at the contact. "But I have conditions." Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers turned to intertwine with mine. "Such as, I keep my apartment, I pay my own way as much as possible, I want to finish school on my own terms, with student loans like everyone else." I took a breath, steadying myself. "And we take things slowly, really slowly. I want to earn your respect as much as your desire." "You already have my respect. Then prove it. Court me properly. Date me like you would any woman you were interested in. No more playing protector. I want you to see me as an equal partner." Richard was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing what I was asking for. It would mean giving up control, trusting me to make my own decisions, accepting that I might choose to leave at any time. "Okay," he said finally, his voice soft but determined. "But I have a condition too." "Which is?" "Complete honesty. If you ever feel pressured, controlled, or like the power dynamic is unhealthy, you tell me immediately. No suffering in silence to spare my feelings." "Deal." I squeezed his hand, feeling something warm and hopeful unfurl in my chest. So, where do we start? Richard's smile was slow, genuine, the first truly relaxed expression I'd seen from him since that night in the cafe months ago. How about dinner tomorrow night? Somewhere public, Dutch treat, with the understanding that you'll drive yourself home afterward. Perfect. I grinned, feeling lighter than I had in months. It's a date, our first real date. The next few weeks were a revelation. Richard courted me with the patience of a man who understood that the best things were worth waiting for. He picked me up for dates in his own car, rather than sending a driver, took me to places where I could afford to pay my half, listened when I talked about my classes and my job at the gallery, like my 19-year-old perspective actually mattered. But more than that, he let me see sides of him I'd never glimpsed before. The way he'd get lost in thought while driving, humming unconsciously to songs on the radio. How he'd laugh, really laugh at my terrible jokes, his whole face transforming with genuine amusement. The careful way he'd ask about my day, not as a guardian checking on a charge, but as a man genuinely interested in the life of the woman he was falling for. "You're different now," I told him one evening as we walked through the park after dinner, the autumn air crisp with the promise of winter. "How so?" "Less controlled, more human." I bumped his shoulder playfully. "I like this version of you." "This is who I am when I'm not terrified of taking advantage of someone," he admitted, his hand finding mine in the growing darkness. "It's who I am when I trust that the woman I'm with is choosing to be there." "I am choosing," I said softly, stopping to face him under a streetlight that cast everything in golden hues. "Every day, Richard, I'm choosing you." The way he looked at me then, like I was a miracle he'd never expected to receive, made my heart race with anticipation for what was coming, because I could feel it building between us, the inevitable moment when our careful courtship would give way to something deeper, more intimate. "Sophia," he said, his voice rough with want he was no longer trying to hide, "I need you to know that when you're ready." "I know," I whispered, understanding what he couldn't quite say. "And Richard, I think I'm almost ready." The promise hung between us, electric and inevitable, as we walked back to his car hand in hand, both of us knowing that our patient rebuilding was about to give way to something neither of us could resist much longer. It happened on a Wednesday night in November, 6 weeks after we'd started dating again. Richard had taken me to a small art exhibition downtown. Nothing fancy, just local artists displaying their work in a converted warehouse space. But the way he'd listened as I explained the different techniques, the genuine interest in his questions, the pride in his eyes when I discussed a piece with the artist herself, it all combined to create a perfect evening that felt like the culmination of everything we'd been building toward. "Thank you," I said as we stood outside my apartment building, the November air crisp enough that I could see my breath. "For what?" "For tonight, for these past weeks, for letting me find my way back to you." I looked up at him, this man who'd become everything to me through patience rather than possession, for proving that love doesn't have to diminish anyone. Richard's hands cupped my face, his thumbs brushing across my cheekbones with infinite tenderness. "Sophia, you don't know what these weeks have meant to me. Seeing you confident, independent, choosing to be with me not because you need me, but because you want me." "I do want you," I whispered, the admission carrying weight we both understood. "I want you in every way possible." The air between us shifted, electric with possibility and desire that had been building for months. Richard's eyes darkened, his breathing growing shallow as he searched my face for any sign of uncertainty. "Are you sure?" His voice was rough, strained with the effort of offering me one last chance to change my mind. "Because, Sophia, if we do this as equals," I finished, standing on my toes to brush my lips against his. as two people who love each other and want to show that love in every way possible. The kiss that followed was different from the careful, restrained contact we'd shared during our courtship. This was hunger, need, months of denied desire finally given permission to exist. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, Richard's forehead rested against mine. "Come upstairs," I whispered. My apartment had never felt smaller than it did with Richard in it, his presence filling the space with possibility and tension. He stood by the windows, looking out at the city lights, while I locked the door behind us, both of us suddenly aware that we were alone in a way we'd never been before. "Sophia," he said without turning around, "I need you to know that we can stop at any time. If you change your mind, if anything feels wrong." "Richard." I moved to stand behind him, my hand sliding around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. "Look at me." He turned in my arms, his blue eyes vulnerable in a way that made my heart ache with love. "I'm 49 years old," he said quietly. "I've been with other women, but this, what we have, it feels like the first time for everything that matters." "For me too," I whispered, reaching up to begin unbuttoning his shirt. "For me too." What followed was perfect in ways I'd never imagined possible. Richard loved me like I was art come to life, every touch reverent, every kiss a promise of forever. He showed me that experience and innocence could create something beautiful together, that the fear we'd both carried about our connection was nothing compared to the perfection of finally surrendering to love. He was patient when I was nervous, gentle when I was overwhelmed, passionate when I was ready for more. And when he whispered, "I love you," against my skin as we moved together in the moonlight streaming through my bedroom windows, I understood that this was what all the waiting had been for. This moment when two souls recognized each other completely. Afterward, as we lay tangled in my sheets, Richard's arms around me like he was afraid I might disappear, I traced patterns on his chest and marveled at how right everything felt. "No regrets?" he asked softly, his lips pressed against my hair. "Only that we waited so long," I replied, tilting my head to meet his eyes. "But maybe we needed to wait. Maybe we needed to become the people who could love each other this way." "Maybe we did," he agreed, pulling me closer. "I love you, Sophia, more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too," I whispered back. "All of you, forever." And as we drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, I knew that this was just the beginning of our real story, the one where love conquered fear, where patience created passion, and where two people who should never have worked together discovered they were absolutely perfect for each other. 2 years later, I stood in the same gallery where I'd first understood what I wanted, but this time I wasn't an employee. I was the featured artist. My exhibition, Unexpected Harmonies, explored the beauty found in unlikely combinations, inspired by my own journey from broken teenager to confident woman, from victim to equal partner. Richard stood across the room, watching me explain a piece to potential buyers, his eyes soft with the pride and love that had only grown stronger with time. At 51, he was more handsome than ever, success and happiness having added depth to his features rather than age. "Ready?" he asked when the last guest had left, offering me his arm. "More than ready," I replied, though my heart was racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the successful opening. We drove to the beach house we'd bought together 6 months earlier, our first major purchase as equals, both our names on the deed. As we walked along the moonlit shore, Richard stopped suddenly, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Sofia Martinez," he said, dropping to one knee in the sand. "Will you marry me? Not because you need me, not because I'm rescuing you, but because two people who love each other want to build a life together." "Yes," I whispered, tears streaming down my face as he slipped the ring onto my finger. Yes, yes, yes. Our wedding was small, intimate, held in the garden where we'd had our first real conversation about trust and love. Maya was my maid of honor, and even Roberto and Carmen sent their grudging congratulations. Apparently, marrying a billionaire had finally made me worthy of their approval. But the real joy came 18 months later when I held our daughter Elena, named for the woman whose memory had first opened Richard's heart to suffering. As I watched my husband cradle our baby, tears of wonder streaming down his face, I marveled at how far we'd both come. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her father," I replied, meaning every word. Sometimes love doesn't follow the rules society sets for it. Sometimes it happens between people who seem impossibly different, who face judgment and doubt from a world that doesn't understand. But when love is real, when it's built on respect, choice, and the courage to see past surface differences to the souls underneath, it creates something beautiful enough to silence every critic. Our story began with someone caring enough to notice pain and act on it, but it became great when that care transformed into something neither of us saw coming, a partnership that made us both stronger, better, more complete than we'd ever been alone. Age is just a number when two hearts beat in perfect rhythm, and love, real love, doesn't diminish anyone. It amplifies everything beautiful about who you already are.
Your heart knows the way. Subscribe and follow the beauty.